Greetings and durud. Welcome to today's season premiere of the 2025-2026 Iranian Studies Initiative lectures in collaboration with the University of California, Santa Barbara. I am Alireza Ardakani of Farhang Foundation. We are a 100% member-supported, non-political, non-religious, and not-for-profit organization with the sole mission to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture for the benefit of the global community. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Farzin Vejdani from the Toronto Metropolitan University for his lecture on policing, punishment, and authority in Iran. This series is made possible with the generous support of the Qajar-era Iran Foundation. Please note that we will be holding a Q&A session at the end of today's talk. So please do submit your questions for Dr. Vejdani via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Janet Afari, renowned scholar and the director of the Iranian Studies Initiative at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Very much for this introduction, Mr. Ardakani. I'm delighted to introduce the first speaker of our 2025-26 lecture series, Professor Farzin Vejdani. Dr. Vejdani is an associate professor of Middle East history at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. He received his PhD from Yale University's Department of History and was a visiting fellow at Massey College and Harvard Law School's program on law and society in the Muslim world. His recent book, Private Sins, Public Crimes, Policing, Punishment, and Authority in Iran, was published by Yale University Press last year. His first book, Making History in Iran, Education, Nationalism, and Print Culture, published by Stanford University Press, received an honorable mention from the Hushanpur Shariati Iranian Studies Book Award. In these and other works, Dr. Vejdani has explored the themes of everyday Qajar society, law, urban crime, folklore, transnational Persian print networks, as well as the connected histories of the Ottoman Empire, India, and Iran. And just a reminder to our viewers that, as always, this lecture and others in this series will be live streamed and available via social media, including YouTube and Facebook. I hope you join us for the remainder of the talks in the series, which will continue through May of 2026. We're delighted to have you with us, Dr. Vejdani.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Dr. Afari, and thank you for the Farhang Foundation for inviting me. Let me just jump right in terms of what I'll be talking about today. So much of my argument flows from an understanding of what constitutes a crime. The German jurist and theorist Carl Schmitt argues that the state, embodied by the sovereign, is the ultimate legal arbiter, rendering moral concerns irrelevant. Within Islamic legal studies, people have approached this from different and often non-state perspectives. While Halak, for example, argues that the Sharia is an ethical and moral system in which offenses are violations of God's law rather than those of the state. Seeing law and morality on a continuum, the scholar Muhammad Kamali views acts as falling on a spectrum of obligatory, recommended, permitted, reprehensible, and prohibited within the Sharia. And it's only obligatory and prohibited acts that fall within the purview of the law because they are subject to sanction, while the remaining three categories constitute moral concerns because they're not. Now, recent studies by the late Roy Mutahedeh, Michael Cook, Kristen Stilt, Intisar Rupp, and others have instead viewed the legal or moral status of an act as dependent on its public or private character. And it's really inspired by these studies that I've applied many of their insights as a key lens through which to understand 19th century Iran. In my book, I typically do not use public and private as direct translations from Persian or Arabic, but as categories describing related concepts, practices, and principles. So, for example, I don't use public to refer to the public sphere in the Habermasian sense, or state-owned or commonly owned property. I also avoid using public law to refer to individual state relations in tax, criminal, or constitutional matters, nor do I use private to mean individually owned property. Instead, I use public to mean acts which are manifest and often described as debased or profane, while private encompasses acts which are secret, sacred, and inviolable. This distinction is crucial to understanding why certain acts were considered punishable crimes. Medieval Christianity provides meaningful parallels. And so here you have the idea of private or hidden sins that could be atoned for in secret, while public and notorious sins required public punishment. Building on this framework, I examine how this public-private distinction affects policing, rules of evidence, and punishment. In Qajar, Iran, the Islamic concept of commanding good and forbidding wrong, or amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy az munkar, was often deployed as justification for moral policing. The basis of moral policing was the nature of the act. Public illicit acts were subject to it, while illicit acts that occurred in private were not. The rules of evidence similarly had a public dimension to them. Conviction was on the basis of Islamic law or government law. Typically, this would require either a confession or eyewitness testimony and an oath procedure in the case of intentional homicide. In cases where evidence was circumstantial and the act was, in a sense, private, the state relied on another mechanism for publicizing the secret sin, namely judicial torture. Finally, punishment was almost always public because crime harmed and affected the entire community and/or injured the sovereign. Public punishments function not only as deterrent lessons or ibrat, but also as forms of shaming in the case of punitive parades, public bodily marks in the case of branding or haircutting punishments, or containment of public harm through mechanisms such as imprisonment. And here I have an example of a public shaming ritual that would have occurred where someone is put in a bridle and paraded around the bazaar. Okay, so in terms of the sources used to study crime and punishment in Iran, I argue there's generally been an over-reliance on European language sources. These sources often betray bias and condescension, reducing Qajar law to backwardness, arbitrary violence, chaos, and incoherence. Even well-meaning attempts at reading such European sources against the grain ignores the fact that there are a plethora of Persian archival primary sources through which to understand crime, policing, and punishment in Iran on its own terms, including as it pertains to the lives of ordinary subjects. And so in the spirit of such a corrective, my book draws on primary sources culled from archives, including the Ayatollah Borujerdi Library, the Kakh Golestan Archive, the Majlis Library, the Malik Library, and especially the Sazman Asnad va Kitabkhane Milli Archive. Many of the other primary sources that I've used include recently published archival materials from Iran. So in many ways, the narrative arc of my book follows the types of sources that I've found. I start in the book by dealing with legal norms, such as those found in Shia jurisprudence, advice literature, and reformist tracts, before turning to more concrete laws in the form of imperial decrees, administrative manuals, and codes. The rest of the book deals on the everyday aspects of crime, policing, and punishment in the cities of Esfahan, Shiraz, and Qom. And there I rely on government and police reports, newspapers, and telegraphic correspondences. Now, instead of giving a comprehensive account of the book's argument and evidence, what I'd like to highlight today is a running theme throughout the book, namely privacy and sanctity, especially as it relates to the home or the domicile and sanctuaries. According to Michael Cook, three basic principles lay at the core of an Islamic notion of privacy: the prohibition on spying and prying, the duty not to divulge what would dishonor a Muslim, and the sanctity of the home. Privacy was connected to the domicile, or harem, which was the part of the house rendered inaccessible to unrelated outsiders, and also to the body's valorization in Islam through the shielding of zones of shame, also known as aura. Government and religious authorities, along with ordinary subjects, all invoke the Islamic duty of forbidding wrong and upholding public morality, which is sometimes referred to as hisba or ihtisab, as justifications for policing. But this duty was tempered by the equally significant principle of the domicile's inviolability. So the duty to police usually covered manifest crimes occurring outside the domicile, except in extreme circumstances, as I'll talk about, such as an impending murder. Therefore, the domicile was a locus of sanctity and was theoretically protected from the reach of the government and religious authorities or even neighbors. It's precisely the domicile's strong inviolability that made it the site of underground parties where entertainment, music, dancing, alcohol, and illicit sex occurred in major urban centers in Iran. The boundaries between the privacy of the domestic residence and the public of the street became blurred, however, when one or more actors decided that private sin crossed the threshold into public crime, either by virtue of sounds, such as musical or alcohol-induced sounds. And here I think of the concept of arbade in Persian, that spilled into the streets or through knowledge or more likely suspicion of illicit acts. Now, the ambiguous nature of such sin or slash crime often triggered a raid into the domicile by the ulama and their supporters, concerned and moralizing neighbors, and or more rarely local policing authorities in a manner that lays bare the tension between various understandings of public and private. And here I have an image from 1858, 1859 manuscript or lithograph of Thousand and One Nights that gives you a sense of how the Qajars imagined this kind of underground party culture behind closed doors. Within Islamic jurisprudence, crimes that warranted fixed mandatory punishments, which are known as hudud crimes, singular had, included theft, highway robbery, fornication, known as zina, the false accusation of fornication, drinking wine, and apostasy. Hudud crimes were public insofar as the crime had to be manifest. It had to be witnessed by a prescribed minimum number of witnesses who could provide consistent statements, or an individual had to confess this crime before a judge and court witnesses. And yet, hudud crimes were rarely meted out because of the countervailing significance of privacy in Islamic jurisprudence. These same acts, when committed in private, such as an inviolable domicile away from prying eyes, were not subject to punishment so long as it did not become public knowledge. To violate this privacy, even in the pursuit of uncovering such an act, was considered sinful insofar as it constituted a form of spying, tajassus, and a violation of sanctity, hatke hormat or pardedari. Certain Islamic regulations had a clear spatial and visual dimension. Non-Muslim protected populations, known as zimmis, were not to display publicly what was illicit to Muslims. For example, zimmis were not allowed to drink wine, consume pork, or play entertainment music publicly, even if it conformed to their own religious laws. If a Muslim destroyed or seized a non-Muslim's wine, instruments of amusements, or pork in their home, they were liable for property damage. These regulations were rooted in the principle of forbidding wrong, with the difference that non-Muslims were allowed to do certain activities in private that Muslims were barred from doing altogether. The public prohibition of acts that were otherwise permissible privately for zimmis appears to have been for fear of contagion. By seeing alcohol, pork, and illicit musical instruments, Muslims might be tempted to imitate the forbidden action. And so that's why, this whole idea of containing the harm within the domicile is so important, a really important assumption. Iranian reformists who began to engage more deeply with European notions of law often drew on Islamic notions of privacy to articulate modern legal concepts. And a good example of this is Mustashar ad-Dawleh, the author of Yek Kalameh, an influential treatise on modern European law and its compatibility with Islamic law, who equated individual liberty, hurriyat shakhsiyeh, with Islamic notions of privacy and due process. Individual liberty meant that, quote, the body of every person is free and no one has the power to slap or punch them, lie about them, or swear about them. He saw this as linked to Islamic prohibitions on spying and entering the domicile uninvited. Police codes embodied similar understandings of privacy. The Guards Barracks Code of 1878 defined police jurisdiction spatially according to the publicness of the crime. Guards were responsible for catching drunks, thieves, and gamblers within 50 paces of their barracks, but not beyond it. The code also limited the guard's power to enter the domicile outside of emergencies. Therefore, a guard and a patrolman could go to the door of the house to investigate a potential crime, but they were barred from entering it unless they had deduced that a theft or a murder was in progress. So I want to give some examples of what I've been talking about. Now, despite these relatively clear-cut delineations of private and public, cases pertaining to suspected Muslim alcohol consumption inside their homes became contentious affairs since they highlighted the tension between the Islamic sanctity of the domicile and the prohibition on spying in the course of policing vice. In the summer of 1890, two members of the ulama, Mirza Muhammad Hussein Mujtahid and Haji Sheikh Ali Pishnamaz, heard sounds coming from the house of Mirza Agha, which they assumed to be signs of a drinking party. They then dispatched a group of seminarians who, instead of knocking on the door and making their presence known, as prescribed in the Quran, entered the residence from the door and the wall, where they found nothing but a few broken bottles of sour grape juice, abaqure, and lemonade. Despite this, they started to drag everyone out of their residence. Now, these residents, aided by their neighbors, beat up the seminarians in response. In the morning, the offended party collectively requested that the government punish the seminarians for their actions. The government ruled that it was against the Sharia for the seminarians to enter the house without notice and drag out respected men. It decided not to banish the seminarians, but made them promise to desist from such actions in the future. In the shrine city of Qom, a prostitute and his pimp used the privacy of the home as a cover for their activities. Malik Tarke, a Tehrani prostitute, had been banished to Qom in the late 1860s by order of Nasruddin Shah. She took up clandestine residence in Qom at the house of a shrine servant, Sayyid Talib, who was her pimp and lover. Her clientele included, not surprisingly, the city's ruffians or lutis. When the neighborhood headman saw a ruffian frequenting this residence, he visited the residence, saw the woman, and detained her. The governor ruled that the woman and her pimp should be banished from the city. In a ritualized parade, the neighborhood headman, Haji Hashim, put the woman on a donkey and banished her from the city gate. As she left the city, she addressed the crowd somewhat dramatically, saying, quote, "There is not a single man to be found in all of Qom who could keep me in this land, and so I have to leave this place in a state of utmost abjectness and poverty." Much like the domicile, sanctuaries constituted a domain of sanctity in which the regular ability of both religious and political authorities to carry out violence was spatially suspended. The practice of taking sanctuary, which is known in Persian by a number of terms, including bast, tahassun, and panah, in Qajar-era, stood outside regular norms of punishment and retribution, much as it did in medieval and early modern Europe. So the medievalist George Dubey observes that there was a sacred significance to privacy in medieval Europe through peace regulations that made churches and villages in which they were housed as, quote, zones of immunity where violence was prohibited. Similarly, sanctuaries in Mecca and to a lesser extent Medina were spaces in which violence was prohibited, including the implementation of otherwise mandatory punishments and retributions, such as those hudud punishments that I had been talking about earlier. Generally, violence was prohibited in the sanctuary even towards animals and plants. In Qajar-era Iran, the shrine of a Shi'i imam or descendants of an imam, which were known as imamzades, a mosque, a royal stable, a telegraph office, or even the home of a respected Islamic scholar or notable, could act as a sanctuary for someone accused of committing a serious crime. As Iran joined modern international diplomacy, consulates and embassies likewise served as sanctuaries because of the principle of extraterritoriality. Throughout the 19th century, the practice of taking refuge at sanctuaries seriously limited the government's ability to capture and punish criminals. Sanctuaries operated then as a liminal space. On one level, they were private like the home and enjoyed many of the same protections from violation and invasion. On another level, they were profoundly public, visible spaces open to all who sought their shelter. Although sanctuaries functioned as spatialized arenas of redress and places of political protest, their common use by people accused of crimes became particularly problematic for a government that was trying to uphold a notion of equal application of the law across all territories under its domination. Sanctuaries were, therefore, exceptional legal spaces that created an uneven legal geography. Government efforts at applying the law consistently across space invariably paralleled attempts to either abolish or regulate the use of sanctuaries by criminals. The famous Italian 18th century penal theorist Cesare Beccaria captured the thrust of these efforts well when he stated, quote, "Within a country's borders, there should be no place which is outside the law. Its power should follow every citizen like a shadow. Impunity and asylum differ only in degree. And since the certainty of punishment makes more of an impression than the harshness of asylums, invite men to commit crimes more than punishments deter them from it. To increase the number of asylums is to create so many little sovereign states because where the law does not run, their new laws can be framed opposed to the common ones, and there can arise a spirit opposed to that of the whole body of society." For similar reasons to those outlined by Beccaria, the reformist Prime Minister Amir Kabir sought to abolish the practice of bast in cities like Tehran and Tabriz, with varying success in the 1840s and 1850s. He also protested European diplomatic protection of people pursued by Iranian authorities as a violation of local sovereignty. While the reasons for Amir Kabir's eventual downfall are complex and multifaceted, and have been covered in Abbas Amanat's Pivot of the Universe, an immediate trigger was his supposed violation of the sanctuary. So Amir Kabir apparently boasted, quote, "It was I who destroyed the rebels of the court and left no place as a sanctuary and refuge, malja va panah, for them in all of Iran." In response, Nasruddin Shah launched into a tirade telling him that removing all sanctuaries in Iran was, quote, "the greatest treachery he had done to both religion and government." Despite this pretext for removing Amir Kabir from office, the Shah similarly concerned himself with preventing criminal asylums in sanctuaries. In 1852, he issued an imperial decree or farman in which only the Shah Abdul Azim shrine near Tehran and the Masumeh shrine in Qom were recognized as sanctuaries for the oppressed and afflicted, while excluding evildoers, troublemakers, criminals, and murderers. What's interesting about a lot of these farmans is that they were published in official newspapers such as Waqai Ittifaqiyya. Some regulations on criminal asylums emanated from the provinces before being adopted countrywide. So this is a fascinating phenomena that I realized in the course of writing the book, where you would have regulations or rules being set up in the provinces, and then the Shah would pick them up as being a good idea and send them out as an administrative manual throughout the rest of the country. In 1854, Muayyad ad-Dawla, the governor of Shiraz, banned the use of city shrines for illegitimate asylum. Using guarantorship, he made shrine servants promise to block thieves, murderers, troublemakers, and corrupt government officials from entering their shrines. His argument for the ban expressed the spatial logic in which justice was to apply uniformly. Quote, the sanctuary, bast, was intended for a wronged person who was unable to find someone to deliver justice to them. Now, praise be to God, justice and equity may be found everywhere as it pertains to the rights of wronged ones. So there is no need for people to take refuge in the holy precincts or elsewhere. The regulations' justifications mirror those made in early modern Europe for dismantling criminal asylums and sanctuaries on the grounds that equality before the law, universal rights, and due process ensure justice and thus render sanctuaries redundant. Despite these efforts, the use of sanctuary by criminals continued unabated for another 7 years. And so in April or May of 1861, a report based on a gathering of certain notables, ulama, and relevant parties led to the drafting of a series of sanctuary regulations in Shiraz. The governor Muayyad-ud-Dawla passed these regulations, which in turn the Shah approved and sent out as an administrative manual to other provinces. The regulation's third article states that murderers and thieves should absolutely be barred from the sanctuary. If they were to be given such entrance, it was their responsibility, the responsibility of the shrine guardian to detain them and turn them over to the authorities to face, quote, a ruling in line with the Sharia and punishment commensurate with their actions. Now, this marked a unique shift by making shrine guardians responsible for policing and imprisoning suspected criminals. The fourth article placed a further restriction. In order to avoid the ballooning of sanctuary spaces, it limited the sanctuary borders to the Shah Cheragh Shrine, the Sayyid Mir Muhammad Shrine, and the Masjid-e-No Mosque, while excluding the madrasas, shops, and bazaars in its environs, because that's where people or criminals had been taking refuge in earlier periods. In 1863, the government issued a regulation specifically for the Shah Abdulazim Shrine, which marked a distinct shift to using Sharia justifications. The drafting of this document included a consultative body, Majlis-e-Shura, and two members of the local ulama, one of whom stated that this document would strengthen God's commandments and ensure the implementation of hudud punishments. The text of this document said that three categories of criminals, murderers, thieves, and violators of, quote, chastity and honor, ismat va namus, essentially, probably referring to rapists in this case, should be barred from the sanctuary and not be protected. If they entered the sanctuary, the shrine guardian should hold them there as prisoners without molesting or torturing them for a period of 3 months. In the case of murderers, the Sharia trial would determine whether the heirs of the murdered were entitled to lex talionis or qisas, or compensation. In cases of theft or rape, there should similarly be a determination as to whether hudud punishments applied. If the suspects prove their innocence through appropriate legal documentation, they were to be released immediately. This version of the ban was almost exclusively framed in relation to the Sharia crimes, in marked contrast to similar earlier documents. The timing of the shift roughly coincided with other official codes and administrative manuals that tended to draw more firmly on Sharia terminology of hudud and qisas and avoided explicitly westernized reformist language that was more common in the early 1850s and later in the 1870s. In a slightly later version of a similar imperial decree dating from 1865-1866, the decree stated that the heirs of a murdered individual had the right to drag the murderer out of the sanctuary to carry out qisas on them once their case had been proven at a Sharia court. The text argued that implementing Sharia rulings took precedence over respect, ihtiram, for criminals in asylum. It ended by stating that previous inauspicious sovereigns had dragged people out of the shrine with violence, but during Nasruddin Shah's reign, the governor of Tehran would have 6 attendants and cavalry guard the shrine and block criminals from escaping, in addition to having their property and house seized and their families detained until such time as they came out. Otherwise, the text states they could stay in asylum until they died. The juxtaposition of crime and sanctity is best exemplified in the city of Qom, which was paradoxically a magnet for criminals and outcasts who take sanctuary in the Masumeh shrine. From at least the 17th century onward, Qom was a sanctuary for criminals. One European observer compared the extraordinary protections afforded to asylum seekers in Qom to the concept of habeas corpus, insofar as they operated as a check on arbitrary government authority. Looking to more contemporary equivalents, another European traveler drew parallels between Qom's sanctuary practices and the Alsatia neighborhood of London and the precincts of Holyrood in Edinburgh, which had similar asylum functions. The tenure of the Qom governor Abdul Ali Adib al-Mulk in the 1860s witnessed a novel assembly of techniques to monitor vice, curtail the criminal use of sanctuaries, and employ guarantorship for people in authority over criminals. Shrine servants used the shrine's unique spatial status for prostitution rings, drunken parties, theft, especially of pilgrims, and disorderly conduct. He described the shrine servants' drunken parties in the following unflattering terms. Quote, 3 or 4 hours into the night, they, meaning the shrine servants, gather together at the top of the cemetery and at the head of Muslims' graves, where they drink wine and play tambour, a kind of lute instrument, gamble, and engage in all sorts of disorder, or harzegi, and evil with female and male prostitutes, ajanede va amarede. End quote. The main spatial nexus for their criminal activities were their residences, which were located in the shrine's vicinity and therefore considered within the bast zone. Shrine servants tricked pilgrims into residing with them before robbing them or extending their hands to their women and children. They also housed murderers, wine imbibers, thieves, otherwise people described as being immoral and appropriators of government funds there. Shrine servants facilitated prostitution rings at their homes for male pilgrims who were away from their wives. So think again of the case of Malik Tarke that I described earlier. Male and female prostitutes were allowed to carry out their trade as the shrine servants protected people, or ma'man, and protected residents, or mustajir, which generated tremendous revenues for the shrine servants. Adib al-Mulk explained why reforming the 700-year-old bast practices in Qom was particularly challenging. He cited a proverb stating that the eyes of Qomis, and in fact all Iranians, were fixated on two domes, or gonbads, the golden dome of the shrine of Fatima and the green dome on the head of the shrine guardian, or mutavalli bashi, who combined the rank of Sayyid, leadership, riyasat, and shrine guardianship, tuliyat. This image was apt because it captured the significance of the dome as a physical space of refuge and as a metaphor for the social network around its guardian who benefited from its exceptional spatial status. The governor was concerned since the bast zone had ballooned far beyond the initial shrine area to encompass houses and the side streets adjacent to the shrine sanctuary, or haram, and at the head of the cemetery, which collectively constituted half of the city. He considered Bast's intention to be for the public common good, or maslahat, but instead the shrine servant's home had become dens of the, quote, most corrupt corruptors. Adib al-Mulk, therefore, set out to reform the neighborhood around the shrines and its adjacent areas, since all other reforms hinged on greater control over this space. And this is an image of Adib al-Mulk, and it's part of the collection of photographs that Nasruddin Shah's photographs. And this is an image of some of the shrine guardians that I've been talking about in the 19th century. Adib al-Mulk embarked on a heated debate with the shrine guardian, Faiz Asar, about the nature and intention behind Bast, since without his consent and cooperation, the governor would be incapable of actualizing his desired reforms. Now, the exchange between the two men revealed the various vested material interests behind the tradition of Bast and its religious justification. It also showed how, despite being a government official, Adib al-Mulk redefined the meaning of Bast by invoking Sharia, while attempting to circumscribe its spatial boundaries in a manner consistent with earlier and contemporary efforts promoted by Nasruddin Shah. So in Adib al-Mulk's initial letter to Faiz Assar, he articulated his understanding of criminal liability, in which people in authority were responsible for their subordinates, meaning that Faiz Assar was responsible for the actions of the shrine guardians because he was the leader of the group, or Sheikhul Ta'ifeh, and thus capable of bringing them to account, punishing them, and banishing them from the shrine grounds. So to this end, he wanted the shrine guardian to stamp a guarantor document making him responsible for their actions, in addition to agreeing to strip some of them of their positions, having others detained or summoned, and making the remaining shrine guardians stamp a guarantor document agreeing not to harbor criminals or engage in criminal activities. Adib al-Mulk hoped that these measures would deter them from acting against the public interest and make them subject to Sharia punishments. Now, Faiz Assar, for his part, responded to Adib al-Mulk in a meeting by highlighting the economic reasons why the shrine servants would not sign a guarantor document, the inability of past governments to control activities in their residences, and the inviolability of the Bast principle in Islam. He claimed that the shrine servants, who numbered roughly 700 with 2,000 to 3,000 dependents, would lose their power, status, and livelihood from criminals operating in their homes if they signed a guarantor document. The Mutawalli Bashi further pointed out that no government official had ever enjoyed sovereignty or tasallut over their houses, nor had they succeeded in expelling thieves or prostitutes from their doors. Since not even the powerful reformist Prime Minister Amir Kabir was capable of undoing Bast practices, why would Adib al-Mulk be any different? He reasoned that the Bast tradition traced back to the origins of Islamic history and had a 700-year-old history in Qom, so it couldn't be easily violated. Adib al-Mulk countered with religious reasoning as well, which was rooted both in the Shah's farmans and Islamic jurisprudence. First, he argued that Bast was reserved only for the wronged, or mazlumin, and not for the troublemaker, fornicator, ruffian, evildoer, language that echoed the Shah's farmans. Second, he claimed that criminals should be subject to God's rulings, hukm khuda, meaning the Sharia. Shrine servants should therefore expel criminals from the sanctuary by cutting off their water and food supplies so government officials could capture and punish them according to the law. He asked the Mutawalli Bashi rhetorically why he, as a believer in the Sharia, would allow the houses of shrine servants, which were located next to the haram of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, to become distilleries, shireh-khaneh, brothels, jendeh-khaneh, and dens of thievery, dozdgah. This constituted the ultimate disrespect to the sanctity or hurmat of the Sharia. The governor ended by threatening to petition Nasruddin Shah, saying that everyone stamped the guarantor documents except the shrine servants because the Mutawalli Bashi refused to do so. He also reminded Faiz Assar that all shrine guardians were mere representatives of the Shah, who was the ultimate guardian of all the country's endowments. Therefore, he could strip them of their position at any time. In the end, Faiz Assar relented and accepted the governor's terms in the face of this threat. Now, despite Adib al-Mulk's best efforts, accused murderers continued to take asylum at the Masumeh Shrine in subsequent decades after his governorship, given the reticence of officials to forcibly remove them. This resulted in jurisdictional friction between the central government, the local government, and the Mutawalli Bashi. For the central government, its ability to deliver justice in murder cases was a key expression of its authority, especially when the victims' heirs invoked their jurisdiction because the governor and Mutawalli Bashi were unable or unwilling to act. In many of the telegraphic exchanges between the central government and the Mutawalli Bashi, both sides articulated competing Sharia discourses. The former was mainly concerned with carrying out hudud and qisas, while the latter emphasized respecting the sanctity of the shrine. Since asylum often bought time to negotiate a settlement or other alternatives to qisas or legal retribution, it became a flashpoint for the enactment of multiple jurisdictions over the issue of the inviolability of the sanctuary and the universal applicability of the law, which usually worked in the favor of the accused. So I thought I'd turn now to one of these specific cases to give you a sense of what was involved. There on the right, you see some of the sources that I used from the Sazman Asnad and Kitabkhane Milli archive. These are telegraphic exchanges, and they're a great source to really get a sense of what the Shah or his representatives are thinking, what the Mutavalli Bashi is thinking, and sometimes what the governor is thinking as well. So, for instance, in 1879, Rajab Ali Yazdi murdered an unnamed Zoroastrian in Yazd before taking refuge at the Masume shrine. On April 3rd of that year, Mirza Hossein Khan Sepah-Salar, who represented the central government, informed the Mutavalli Bashi by telegram that the Shah wanted the man imprisoned in the sanctuary until he could face justice in Tehran. In response, the Mutavalli Bashi confirmed that Rajab Ali was being held firmly in his place, but that this confinement had caused the ulama of Qom and Tehran to mock and complain about him for violating the Bas principles. Sepah Salar responded sharply by reminding the Mutavalli Bashi that the Sharia called for the punishment of those who commit murder and disorderly actions. Therefore, these opinions should not bother him. The Shah's son, Kamran Mirza Naib al-Saltaneh, later requested that the governor Etizad al-Dawleh send Rajab Ali to Tehran under armed escort for investigation. The governor refused on the grounds that this would violate the sanctity of the shrine. So this is what he says in this telegram. How can he be brought out of the sanctuary since the Shah would not be pleased with him being dragged out forcibly and sent to Tehran? The delay tactic worked in Rajab Ali's favor. Roughly a week later, the Zoroastrian heir to the murdered person agreed to accept compensation or diya on the condition that Rajab Ali be banished permanently from Yazd. Failure to do the latter would mean that the heirs would kill him with impunity. The payment of compensation included not only the Islamically prescribed amount of diya for a Zoroastrian, which amounted to 40 tomans, but also a collective contribution of the Shah, the governor, and others in Qom of roughly 100 to 150 tomans to the heirs as a condition for Rajab Ali's release. Rajab Ali also signed a guarantee never to return to Yazd again. To conclude, I'd like to return to the concept of sanctity or hormat, which is closely associated with the privacy of the home and the sanctity of shrines and other sacred spaces. There have been many efforts to articulate some indigenous notion of Islamic rights by scholars of Islam, usually with an appeal to the notion of huquq or haq, which has a long pedigree in Islamic jurisprudence. Part of what my book suggests, however, is that in the 19th century, Iranians drew on the language of hormat, that inviolable dimensions of their bodies, their homes, their property, their dignity, and even their lives, which had been violated, ripped, or exposed, to articulate an analogous notion of what we would call a right. A reinvestigation of the category of hormat, a notion invoked repeatedly by the wronged, irrespective of status group, may serve as a more fruitful starting point for the often fraught activity of cross-cultural and trans-historical translation. Throughout the 19th century, the sanctuary was a significant place of asylums for people accused of crimes and its inviolability, and it caused a lot of consternation for Amir Kabir, Nasruddin Shah, and many local governors. Although the practice of taking sanctuary continued into the constitutional, post-constitutional, and more rarely in the early Pahlavi periods, the centralization and systematization of legal institutions under the Pahlavis brought an end to the practice. By 1935, when Sheikh Taqi Bohlul and others protested the sartorial changes implemented by Reza Shah, the latter reacted by violating the sanctuary of the Gohar Shad Mosque in Mashhad. And that's an image of the Gohar Shad Mosque right there. Over the course of the 20th century, Bast therefore lost its legal connotation of asylum and increasingly came to mean a sit-in and a protest at a specific location. The Pahlavi and Islamic republics' banning of sanctuaries for criminals or accused criminals appears to have been justified on similar grounds as their 19th century antecedents. The criminal has rights to due process, the law is just, and it must be applied universally to all subjects within the borders of the state. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vejdani. Maybe you could close your PowerPoint.
Yep, Uh,
Wonderful. All righty. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. We
thank
have
you.
a lot of questions for you, actually.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see. Let's start with a question about the archives. So, what archival collections did you rely on most heavily for private sins, public crimes, and were there any surprising gaps or silences in the archival record?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I would say I relied most heavily on the Sazman Asnad. I think that was the main archive that I relied on. There were a lot of materials from the Majlis that I used more in terms of manuscript collections, but in terms of the cases in the everyday life, a lot of that is coming from the Sazman Asnad. There are many gaps, definitely. One of the gaps it has to do with the actual Sharia records around apostasy cases and murder cases. So we hear a lot about various rulings that the ulama made in these criminal cases. We rarely have the actual text. There was about four or five cases that I was able to find in a fatwa collection of Muhammad Bagher Shafti, where it was the actual rulings in qasas cases, and it gives a lot of granular detail about what was involved. So that was a rare instance, and so I think it's really up to other scholars to see if there are similar collections that we can find. Part of the problem is that there isn't it's not a centralized archive. It's not like the Ottoman archive where you go and there's multiple copies of various cases and all the documentation is there and neat. It's a very dispersed archive, I would say, when it comes to crime and punishment. So you really have to be creative in the different nooks and crannies that you look at. So those were some of the archival issues that I encountered.
Great, thank you. So I had a question about the notion of privacy as you use the private and public. And I think you discussed this really quite well in the article I read by you about prostitution as a domestic affair. But what you show there is, it reminded me of the old, feminist slogan, the personal is political. In other words, what you show is that there was a lot that was going on in the name of privacy, particularly pimping of women by these male men who were considered their guardians. And
Hmm.
there was really hardly any recourse for these people, both the children, both boys and girls, as well as the women in the household, right? And you show all variety of it, mothers and daughters, sisters. And since this was happening within the private realm, therefore, really no one was supposed to. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's incredible, right? So it's really all the things that we would consider to be vice or criminal or many, I won't say all, but occurred in away from prying eyes, and that I think is because these norms of privacy kind of permeated on so many different levels, whether it was governmental, religious, and just more popular. And so people kind of had a sense that you could get away with a lot of these notions so long as you didn't make it too public. And so that's why, I mean, and this is part of what my article that you're referring to looks into is why we don't have in the 19th century really a culture of brothels. I mean, there are a few references, but even when you look into some of those, it seems that it's just being run out of someone's house.
Mhm.
And so there's a willingness to kind of look the other way. And there's a lot of people that are kind of complicit in this, in everything that's going on in this private realm, that you wouldn't necessarily assume would be involved on face value. So, for example, these shrine guardians that are essentially running prostitution rings out of their homes, they're sort of clearly they're justifying it as a form of sireh
Mhm.
and what have you. But those lines are very blurred. And sometimes I came across cases where individuals would be accused of, well, you're frequenting this such and such prostitute's home, and their defense would be, no, 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 she's my temporary wife, and everything is fine. So there's ways in which that enabled a kind of underground culture of prostitution, but also music and entertainment and of wine consumption that
Right.
was mainstream in a sense. Yeah.
And so a big contrast with the Ottoman Empire, where actually houses of prostitutions were in existence.
Correct.
Um, right. And so this only happens really in the 20th century in Iran when you start to have, well, the Shahrino, the house of prostitution.
Exactly.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, another question, which just kind of relates to what you just said. Another person asked about variations across cities. So you talked a little bit
Mhm.
about Rome, which is, I think, fascinating in and of itself. Tehran, for example, what about Mashhad? Did you find anything about Mashhad, for example?
Uh,
Your
well,
source.
initially I wanted to do Mashhad in Tehran as well,
Okay.
but the book was already too long,
I see.
and I had to cut it down by 50,000 words in the condition that it was. So I had to really rein myself in. What I tried to do is I tried to not have a Tehran focus because I felt as though most of the cases and most of the history, sometimes Tehran is used as a as kind of representing all of Iran, and I didn't think that that was necessarily all that representative. So I tried to pick three different cities of varying size. But yes, I think something similar could be done for Mashhad. I think a lot of the material would probably be in the Astane Quds Razavi
Mm.
archive. And honestly, I didn't have an in there that I could really access the materials, but it would not surprise me if there are similar documents. So the types of documents that I was really searching for were documents that would give us an insight into the everyday. And there are some that would do that for other cities as well. And I took some preliminary notes for other cities as well. But the three that I chose, I thought were all quite rich across the board in different periods. So that's why I actually also went with them, is that I could look at a longer period of time and give a fuller picture of what was happening there. Yeah.
So another person asked, what is the origins of sanctuary bast in the Sharia? Is this a particularly Shiite or even Iranian practice? How, for instance, the bast is different in Sunni lands such as Egypt? If
Mhm, mhm.
can you comment on that issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, sanctuaries, I would argue sanctuaries, at least in well, you do have it across religious traditions. So you have a Jewish understanding of sanctuaries, a Christian understanding of sanctuaries, as I kind of alluded to, Zoroastrian practices of sanctuary, which I found less secondary scholarship on. And then even within an Islamic or Arabian context, it predates Islam. So Mecca was a sanctuary city in the pre-Islamic period as well, right? It was a place where people would go on pilgrimage, and there would be a succession of violence, all the feuds and everything. You had to put that aside in order to go on pilgrimage and what have you. So it has an older pedigree, and then there are definitely important differences. I don't think within Sunni jurisprudence it's really taken all that seriously outside of Mecca and Medina. So you can find early hadith that talk about you can't carry out the hudud and you can't carry out qisas in a shrine, and also there are hadith that talk about not being able to carry it out in mosques as well. So it's not anything particular to Shiism. Now, what happens in Shiism is they take that idea and they say the same sanctity that applies to Mecca and Medina applies to the shrines of the imams. And
Right.
then that idea is then extended even further, and it says, well, it's also the Imamzadehs. So then once you start doing that, I mean, Iran is littered with these Imamzadeh shrines, and so the practice kind of goes on and on. Technically, within Shia jurisprudence, I mean, if you look at, say, Najafi's Jawahir al-Kalam, which is this, 42 or 43 volume Arabic work of Shia jurisprudence that was used as an important textbook in the mid 19th century, he sort of says that it's technically only should be limited to Mecca and Medina. But in the minds of many of the jurists in Iran itself, they obviously had very different ideas.
Fascinating. Okay. So this is really quite directly related to the fact that Shiism has all these imams and therefore imamzadas, and therefore you have a much larger practice of sanctuary.
One parallel that I'll draw that's interesting. So, if you go to Morocco, there they have a similar idea. So you have a lot of descendants of the Prophet, not exactly Shia, but they're Sunni, right? But it's called Sayyid so and so, Sayyid so and so, Sidi. They call it Sidi this, Sidi that, and it's very similar because it's you use that as a way to refer to not only the person but to the place. And those places historically in Morocco were places of sanctuary as well. So you do, I think, have examples in other Sunni uh, kind of countries where this is a widely practiced thing. Less examples that I was able to find in the Ottoman empire, and that's something that I'm curious about to look more into.
Very interesting. We have a question from Professor John Limbert. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. What is the relationship, if any, between the sanctuary principle and the infamous capitulations that gave immunity from Iranian law to Iranians who were under foreign quote unquote protection?
Yeah, so I think it was kind of alluded to what I mentioned to in passing, the extraterritoriality of the embassies and consulates within Iran. That was a spatial expression. So I was really interested in this kind of spatial expression of sanctuaries. That's where you would see, for example, a lot of people taking sanctuary there, and of course, there's always a political use of it during the constitutional period, the famous bast of the constitutionalists at the English legation. Um, but you would have had a lot of people, disgraced government officials, other people who have kind of being accused of various crimes, also taking sanctuary at particular either British or Russian or other legations as
In other
well.
words, if the imams others are legitimate, why not the sanctuary at an embassy, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
very good. Okay, let's see. I have a number of questions are actually about the relationship of your work to today.
Mm.
So, for example, how do you see the politics of moral policing affecting the legitimacy of the state in Iran historically and today is one of these questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. So
Or I could say another one, which is related. In what ways do you see the juridical and policing regimes of Qajar Iran echoed or transformed in the Islamic Republic era?
yeah, so those are wonderful questions. So, I mean, part of what I tried to map out is that there's almost competing Sharia or moralizing discourses in the Qajar era, and the state is actually doing a lot of the same things that the ulama are doing it, but for their own purposes, obviously, for their own for their own ends. And so, what I think happens, and what I sort of argue in the epilogue, is that the Islamic Republic is, in a sense, an extension of debates and street politics that started in the Qajar era. And so part of what I look at is, uh, these efforts to codify the Sharia. And I found this amazing text called the Jame Nasiri, where Nasruddin Shah essentially asks one of the members of the ulama to come up with the code that's based on the Sharia. And so it's referred to in the text as Qanun Islam. And so it's done in the Jame genre, which is more the genre of a legal compendium, but it's meant to be sent out to the provinces and used as a code. So what I argue is that that's actually probably the earliest attempt, because there is a chapter on hudud and qasas and diya and whatever, to codify Islamic criminal law. And in some ways, that's the forerunner to the Islamic criminal law in the Islamic Republic, right? That a lot of these issues have debates or their origins in these earlier practices. So there's that going on. You have figures like Muhammad Baqir Shafti, who argues that the hudud punishments should be carried out in a way against earlier Shia jurists who said that it shouldn't be done in the absence of the hidden imam. And then there's a lot of evidence of people doing Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy as Munkar, even though this too was not supposed to be done technically, according to many of the classical Shia jurists, on the ground. So there's multiple levels at which these practices are kind of embedded within Iranian history. And so for me, looking at the Islamic Republic from the perspective of the 19th century, a lot of it is a fulfillment of a lot of the aspirations of various segments of society and government rather than a rupture.
Except I would actually argue that they're going farther ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've talked about this with regard to gender. So, take for example something like veiling, right? The state
Hmm.
had the right to impose or take away veiling. This was, if to the extent that it was carried out, it was a private marriage. It was a family issue, right? For example.
Hmm.
Or for example, homosexuality. The hudud laws were quite strict about how a person could actually be punished. And in
Yes.
most cases, as you know, the punishment would not be carried out because the
Right.
requirements are so extensive and so detailed, right? And it
Yeah.
involved violation of the privacy, as you were just talking about. But it
Mhm.
seems to me that the Islamic Republic goes much farther. So, for example,
Correct.
when they started entering by force people's houses when they were having a private party, and no neighbor had complained, but they just gave themselves the right, for example, to do that, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
In that sense, they're going much beyond, in some ways, what the Qajar period was doing.
Yes. So what I meant by that is that they're taking the more systematic elements of a codified law
Mhm.
and fusing it with these principles in a way that hasn't been done, right? So what I think happens in the 19th century is that they say, well, wouldn't it be great if these things could be codified? And then the practice that we have, and that's kind of what I show in the chapters dealing with practice, is that it falls short of reality because there are all these other social forces that kind of push back against it. But with a modern state, with modern surveillance, with
Modern state
modern
and modern
technology,
surveillance,
you
both
know,
technology,
that
yeah,
changes the equation, right? So
changes it dramatically,
yeah.
right? Wonderful. Okay, let's see. Do we have time for another question, Mr. Ardakani?
Yes, one more.
Okay, so let's have one more here. Um, How do the rules of harem, I think it's the word, apply to the cases of apostasy? How punishing apostasy was executed and by whom? Was it the government or the mujtahids? So I guess this would be relevant to, for example, the case of the Babis in the
Mhm.
19th century or later the Baha'is, for example. Mhm.
Yeah, so I have a discussion of this in both the Esfahani chapter and especially the Qom chapter. And what's interesting about this is that there are a couple of cases in Qom, for example, cases brought against Baha'is, and what a lot of the Baha'is did in this period was to appear as kind of Orthodox or Muslim in public, but then have their beliefs behind closed doors. And and again, it's kind of fascinating. We have cases where you had certain members of the ulama carry out attacks against Baha'i families or Babi groups and what have you. And then you would have the Baha'is send telegrams to the Shah and to the central court to kind of to essentially come to their protection. And in some cases, that was the case. I found a very interesting telegram from Muzaffar ad-Din Shah, and he says, "Well, they're saying that on the surface they're Muslims, so you shouldn't do tajassus. You shouldn't engage in spying. This is a violation of the Sharia. Basically, leave them alone. As long as they're not openly declaring their beliefs and going out and proselytizing." You have no right to do this sort of stuff. In some of the cases, what's also fascinating about this is the forms of evidence that were used against Baha'is were texts that were stolen from their homes, either from Muslim family members or neighbors. And so there again, you see this idea of violating privacy in the form of getting an apostasy conviction. Apostasy, I would argue, is a kind of wrench in this whole idea that hudud punishments were never carried out. I think they definitely were in the case of Babis and Baha'is. Um, uh, what's interesting is that it's not necessarily always done by one or the other. You have cases where there are case where the trial is done before a Sharia judge. You have other cases where the ruling is made by the Shah, and this is something that I'll be hopefully publishing soon, where Nasruddin Shah himself writes in the margins of certain Babis that were captured in the early 1850s that they should be given the death sentence. So the authority doing it could be both, and sometimes it was a dual project where they worked together. And that's actually where I think judicial torture comes in, because within apostasy trials, at least according to Islamic law, you either have to confess or there has to be some sort of consistent witness testimony, which is difficult to do in apostasy cases, especially if the person is saying, I'm Orthodox or whatever. I believe in the Shia Imams or something like that. So in those cases, either torture was used, or, and this is what I'm hoping to publish on soon, Babis and Baha'is were forced to ritually curse the founders of their religion as a sort of proof that they were true Shias or Muslims.
And because Taqiyya wasn't acceptable in the religion, so this was therefore done. Thank you
Exactly.
so much for this wonderful talk. Appreciate it very much.
So much for the invitation.
Of course.
Thank you. A heartfelt thank you to Dr. Vejdani for joining us from Toronto today and for sharing such an insightful talk, one that resonates deeply and maybe also apply to today's Iran. Dr. Vejdani's book, Private Sins, Public Crimes, is now out and can be purchased by visiting farhang.org or via the link in today's chat. Special thanks to Dr. Janet Afari and the entire team at UC Santa Barbara for organizing this annual lecture series with Farhang Foundation. As always, we invite you to visit farhang.org for all our latest upcoming events, performances, talks, and programs. We thank you again for joining us from across the globe and spending your Saturday with us. And we look forward to welcoming you next time. Until then, we bid you farewell. Thank you, Dr. Vejdani. Thank you, Dr. Afari.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.